Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second part of our lecture. We dealt with World War One in the first part of this lecture in a very cursory, brief way, uh, but that's what we have to do. So now we're going to pick up with more of the consequences and the after effects in the wake of World War One, and then get into Versailles Treaty as well. This is equally fascinating and equally important. We talked in the first lecture about the consequences of World War One, and they are profound for Europe and for the world at large, the Middle East, and we'll get more into the Middle East in this lecture right now. So get comfortable, grab your drink, beverage of choice. I got mine here somewhere. There it is. Got my iced tea ready to go. It's a little lemon and some ice. I guess by definition, that's what iced tea means. And we're ready to go here. So, all right, the Middle East. So this is where we left off in our previous lecture. So let's jump right back in. And so, remember, this is the end of an era. The Ottoman Empire is coming to an end. Although a shadow of it, or the core of it, which would be Turkey, will remain. We'll get to that here just shortly in the lecture as well too. But of course, many parts of the Ottoman Empire, the various Arab groups desperately want their own self-determination, and we talked about that a bit in the last lecture too. And because certainly there's ethnic, linguistic, cultural, national tensions between the Arab world and the Turks, and they are hoping for, again, for some kind of national state, perhaps. Could be a pan-Arab state or perhaps individual Arab states. Probably depends which Arab leader or group you're talking to. Of course, Great Britain desperately wants help from these Arab groups in the fight against the Central Powers. And Turkey, of course, has joined Germany and Austria in the war. And Great Britain wants their help. And so they're more than happy to encourage what turns out to be an illusion, but encourage the Arab peoples that Great Britain and France is on their side and that they're going to help them get their own nation and their own place in the world. But why Great Britain is saying that, as I mentioned before, that's oftentimes a double game. So Great Britain, as you guys know, does not particularly care about that topic. They do care about winning the war. And they also are casting a very avarice eye at the wealth beneath the sand, beneath their feet in parts of the Arab world. Of course, we know that is oil. And so Great Britain and France are both eyeing the future. So they're playing a double game. If you guys are interested, I recommend Lawrence of Arabia by Scott Anderson. So you guys saw this book in your last lecture, and there it is again. You see a subtitle, War, Deceit, Imperial Folly, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. See, war and deceit. The deceit is all sides don't really trust each other, but they all have their own motives and their own aspirations for how things are going to turn out. So we'll come back to that shortly. But okay, and I'm recommending some books right at the end of class for you guys there too. The Peace to End All Peace, which I have in front of you right here. Fabulous book. And also Eugene Rogan's The Fall of the Ottomans. Again, if you guys are history majors and understand the modern world you and I live in, to see the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire at the end or in the wake of World War One and what takes place following that, is really critical to understanding what's going on in the world right now in the Middle East as it continues to play out. So, and again, we'll come right back to that topic here shortly, but let's pick up with a topic I briefly introduced to you guys at the start of the lecture on World War One. I introduced it, but we did not go into detail, and that is the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocide. Now, the Armenian genocide is by far the most well-known of these, and by numbers, it certainly is the most dominant. But the Syrian community and the Greek community also experienced genocide as well too. All right, so let's start with the background to this. We did this when we were talking about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in Ukraine, and it's important to know the background to the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocide. So First of all, as you guys know, the Ottoman Empire, being an empire, encompasses many, many different groups, nationalities, ethnic groups, and religious groups. The Armenians, the Christians, and the Greeks are all Christian minority groups within a larger Islamic or Muslim community, which is the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire historically had been, I'd say, relatively tolerant toward Christian and Jewish groups. They are second-class citizens or third-class citizens. They have to pay a special tax. They're not allowed to proselytize or to promote their religion. But they were to some degree tolerated and protected. They're fellow people of the book according in the eyes of Islam. The Christians and Jews are considered the cousins or brothers of the vast Islamic community. Now, they are confused, a bit misguided cousins and family members, but they are still family. So historically, in the lands of Islam, there are exceptions to this, but in general, the Islamic community was relatively tolerant of Jews and Christians, but within a framework of their inferior and Islam is superior. So they're tolerated almost like your cousin who is poorly educated, does not have the best manners, is not doing so well in life, has not made some good choices. They come to a family reunion. Perhaps you're a bit embarrassed about them, but you're family. They're family. You still want them there because they are family. So you're not going to allow them to maybe stay overnight in your house, but they're family. So you're glad that they came to the barbecue. You're still going to hand them a burger and a soft drink and some coleslaw and some chips and stuff and some dip and invite them to enjoy themselves. So, but they're not an equal part of your family. Your family is well-to-do. Your family is doing well, and you don't want your redneck cousins from the woods, from the foothills, who have 4 or 5 cars in the front yard up on blocks. You don't want them to be running the family, but they are family. So that's a little bit of analogy in a sense how the Islamic majority viewed the Jewish and Christian minority. Now, in this case, the Armenian Christians remain that minority. Again, they're a minority, and to some degree, they're assimilated, but other ways they're not. They have maintained their Christian religion within a vast Islamic community, Islamic culture, and that has led to a feeling of they're an other. They're an other and perhaps not a trustable other living within the Ottoman Empire as seen by some Ottoman authorities. So there had been in the 19th century, there had been a targeting of the Armenian population in a series of massacres already, known as the Hamadan massacres, which you see in front right there. So let me highlight that for you guys. There you go. So Hamadan massacres are a series of anti-Armenian massacres that take place, you see, right before the turn of the century. You see, also known as Armenian massacres, 1894 to 96. And the numbers are not small. We don't know the exact numbers, but anywhere from 800 to 300,000 are killed. So you already had a high level of violence against the Armenian minority. Now, what is the background? And so why is this? And I gave you a general kind of sense and also mentioned that historically the Islamic community in general, and there's exceptions, but in general was a fairly tolerant of the Jews and Christians in a minority status as long as they kept their heads down and kept quiet. They're not equal citizens, but they still can be useful to the Ottoman Empire. So the background to that is the weakened Ottoman Empire had lost quite a bit of territory toward Russia. By the way, you guys know about Russia's expansion, right? Russia has been expanded. For example, the Crimean Peninsula, as you guys know, is part of the Khanate prior to this, and the Crimean Peninsula is not part of Kievan Rus. It's been part of the Islamic world for a long time, but that had been seized by Russia as Russia expanded, as you guys know, expanded into Eastern Europe, and part of that is in the lands that were at least nominally claimed by Ottoman Empire. Now, why does that matter in the context of the Ottoman Empire? Because there's a significant Christian minority, the Armenians, especially in the eastern portion of the Ottoman Empire, which is close to regions now, or even neighboring regions now, to the expanding Russian Empire. So that brings in some fear among the Ottoman authorities that are the Armenian Christians, being Christians, are they loyal to the Ottoman Empire, or do they have a natural affinity to Christian Orthodox Russia? And the fear is that they would prefer probably to be under the Russian Empire, being fellow Christians, and not under Islamic rule in the Ottoman Empire. And so that fear generates concern. Additionally, some of the Armenian Christians had done quite well economically. They've been pushing for greater political equality and autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. And again, some Turks were resentful of that, resentful of some of their economic wealth and prosperity, because again, they're a minority within a larger community. And so the Turks viewed the Armenians as potential or real nationalistic territorial threats. And again, some of that could be just like in the Jewish community, any communities that have a separateness than the other, it's easy to scapegoat them, to buy into conspiracy theories, perhaps to imagine the worst. And that takes place, and that led to a series of pogroms or massacres against the Armenians. The most famous of these obviously the Armenian genocide of World War I would be the Armenian massacres. That gentleman there on the left, Mehmet Talat Pasha, is going to play one of the most critical roles in the Armenian genocide that took place during World War I. So if you're looking for, it's not exactly analogous, but a bit similar when you talk about the Holocaust in Ukraine. You talk about Himmler being head of the SS, obviously beneath Hitler, of course, but Himmler being the most important driver of the horror of the Holocaust in the Ukraine. Talat Pasha, Mehmet Talat Pasha would be one of the most important drivers of what we today know as Armenian genocide. All right, some of the Armenian leaders. Now, by the way, similar to what the Germans would do during the Holocaust in the late 30s into the 40s in World War II. By the way, the Germans in some ways undoubtedly learned and copied some of the things that the Turks did. The Turks, at the start of their campaign of liquidation of the Armenian minority, tried to decapitate the leadership of the Armenian community. So Armenian intellectuals, professors, thinkers, community leaders, well-known businessmen, anybody in the Armenian community who was considered an intellectual or a civic or economic leader of the Armenian community, many of them were arrested, thrown in prison, many of them were executed. That way they'd have a harder time organizing any kind of effective resistance about what's to come next. Now, during World War I, the Ottoman Turks decided to eliminate the Armenian, as they perceive it, threat to the Ottoman state, especially because the Ottoman Turks, once they joined the war, they're at war with Russia. Now, again, we have not talked about that in class so far, and even in the previous lecture of World War I, we didn't get into that really. But remember, World War I encompasses many nations, and the Turks, besides fighting the British and the French in the Middle East, are also fighting the Russians in today what would be the boundary between, say, the area of Georgia and so forth, between the Eastern Ottoman Empire and the expanding southern part of Russia. And the two of them are coming into conflict with each other in outright warfare. And the Turks are deeply afraid. By the way, initially the Russians had made considerable progress into areas of the Ottoman Empire, and that, of course, brought about a great deal of worry that the Armenians perhaps were going to actively join the fighting on behalf of the Russians, or at the very least be a disloyal minority within the ranks that are trying to defeat the Russians. The numbers, again, are hard to calculate precisely, but probably around 1 million Armenians are going to be intentionally killed by the Ottoman Turks during World War I. Again, the background to that is there's a war between the Turks and the Russian force. I want you guys to know this. So As you guys know, there's already considerable tension. There are already been massacres prior to this. Generally, same reasons, by the way. But when this war breaks out, this is going to precipitate the Armenian genocide we know today. And this map right here, it's a little hard to read. It's not in English, but it'll work fine for us. This is the eastern portion of the empire, and these are Russian forces driving down into the eastern portion of the empire. Now, the Turks would push back at times, but this fighting taking place between the Russians and the Turks is going to create a great deal, I guess, of fear, as I mentioned before, within the Ottoman authorities that the Armenians perhaps were going to actively invade. And to make things even more complicated, you see Armenian right here. There's a significant Armenian population in this area. And in the fighting that takes place, there were reports of some Armenians aiding the Russian armies as they invaded into this region. And you can see perhaps why that is. If already the Ottoman government has launched massacres against them in the previous decades, and the Russians are fellow Christians, you could see how some Armenians might think this is a chance of survival, frankly. They would much prefer to have Russian control than Ottoman Turkish control. Now, of course, people are people. Some Armenian Ottoman citizens are not going to participate in this. They're going to stay neutral, and some of them are going to actively fight on behalf of the Turks. People are complex. Communities are complex. So it's not so simple. But certainly in the eyes of the some within the Ottoman government, they don't see that complexity. They see this in stark terms. They already have issues with the Armenian minority community. They don't trust them. They do not believe that they assimilated into the Ottoman society. They're not Muslims. And now they feel that they perhaps are actively engaged in a war against the Ottoman Empire. The map right here shows you the number of deportations. And you can see the Armenian community spread throughout today would be modern-day Turkey itself, but especially here in the central to eastern portion today of Turkey. And you can see the large number of Armenians who are relocated and sent from one location to another. Now, typically, the genocide, the Armenian genocide took place, as I mentioned before, which the Armenian leadership is oftentimes arrested and executed. And it varies from place to place. The Ottoman Empire was not nearly, as I'd say, as systematic and organized as the Nazis were in their killing campaign. It depended quite a bit on where you were, if you were an Armenian within the Ottoman Empire, what your local governors like, what local communities like. It varies from place to place. So some place the death rate of the Armenians is very high. In other regions, not so high. Now, does not mean that all the Armenians are not under pressure. They are, but it does vary to some degree from place to place on the level of violence and participation in the genocide. It goes all the way from official arrests of leaders who often, as you see, sometimes hung or shot or imprisoned. Frequently, you would have an Armenian community simply taken and told you're going to be leaving the community, so pack a suitcase. We're all heading out and we'll go relocate you. That relocation oftentimes is a march to nowhere. I mean, nowhere there is a destination, but the destination is death. The Ottoman Turks do not set up an elaborate killing machine in the context what the Germans would do with the camp system, nor typically are they, I'd say, as systematic, I suppose, in its awfulness as Eisengruppen are, where they take people and have these great massacres simply shooting them. By the way, that did happen. But the Turks tended to have the army round up the Armenians. Some might be killed in the initial roundup and then put on a train, taken somewhere, or forced to walk. Oftentimes forced to walk in the countryside, provided no food or water on these long marches. Frequently, the destination is going to be the deserts of Syria or some other ravine or deserted place. And again, it's a march to nowhere because the purpose of that march typically is death. So no food or water is supplied. So as they march, people naturally begin to fall out of line because they're dying from dehydration, lack of food. Oftentimes, the local communities around them, the Kurds, the Turks, and others will come out and and assault, sexually assault, or kill or murder. The Armenians go by, steal from them, extort any money they had from them. The Turkish soldiers who are ostensibly guarding them, taken to this relocation site, may also participate in these killings. Sometimes they might stop them. Again, it just totally depends who the local commander is. But in general, these are marches into oblivion and into death. Whether it's through shooting, attack with knives and axes and guns with local communities that come out to prey upon this band of people who have no longer any sort of kind of civil protection, no protection of any kind. They're completely vulnerable. Perhaps some of them have valuables, and the communities may come out and prey upon them, and frequently did. So the killings are not all done by the Turkish soldiers. Some of these are done by locals. Again, ironically, that would be somewhat similar to what we see in Ukraine in the Holocaust, and the Holocaust in Poland and Lithuania and so forth, where you have locals who have grievances against the Jews who also come out and sometimes actively participate in the killing along with the Eisengruppe and SS units. They're doing this. That's similar to the Armenian genocide. Here's some examples. Armenian corpses have been burnt alive in a cattle shed. And again, it just depends from place to place what takes place. Sometimes they're taken into a valley and shot. Other times, Armenian men are forced into the Turkish military, as used as cannon fodder. It just really depends a great deal on what village you lived in, if you're Armenian, what the local Turkish army commanders like, what their willingness to participate in this, how dedicated they are to following their orders. Are they planning to exterminate the local community, or they don't particularly care, or they find it distasteful? And you have some Turkish leaders who are resistant. And because of the war and the chaos, again, the level of coordination is not as systematically high as you get, for example, in areas under German occupation in World War II. Many Armenian children are rescued or abducted. Maybe both terms apply, by local Turks, realize that they will die. And so many Armenian children are taken and raised. Sometimes they're raised as a slave in the family. Other times they're raised as one of their children. It varies dramatically from person to person. But you had many Armenian children who their parents and older siblings may die, but they are, again, rescued. It depends on what the rescue's like. Sometimes rescued or abducted. Sometimes they're used in very abusive ways as a slave for various families to take them in. Other times they're raised as a child within that family. You see a telegram from the U.S. ambassador writing Constantinople. You can see a date there, July 16. That's 1915. And the U.S. ambassador is aware, because the scale is so large, of what is taking place. And he's deeply concerned and worried about what is taking place, aware that this means death for many. And let's take a look at that telegram briefly. He writes, "Have you received my 841?" That means a previous message. "Deportation of and excesses against peaceful Armenians is increasing, and from harrowing reports of eyewitnesses, it appears a campaign of race extermination is in progress, under the pretext of reprisals against rebellion." Yeah. By the way, that's a contemporary account by U.S. ambassador, but very good. It is an extermination. They're attempting to exterminate them and saying, well, they potentially are disloyal. Protests as well as threats are unavailable and probably incite the government to more drastic measures, as they are determined to disclaim responsibility for their absolute disregard of capitulations. And I believe nothing short of actual force will, obviously, the United States are not in a position to exert would adequately meet the situation. Translation is like, look, they're killing them. No matter what we say to them and protest the gross inhumanity of this, they're determined to do this. I think nothing can stop the Turks from this campaign of race extermination or genocide outside of outright war against them. You can see, again, this terrible photograph of Armenians who have been, since they're all laid out like that, they're probably outright killed. They probably, again, marched, probably to the middle of nowhere, probably in the process of dying anyways from malnutrition, lack of water, but maybe their guards had enough and they got them to a place that's secluded and decided just to wrap things up by killing them outright. It's in the map there showing the large areas show the massacre sites. And again, just depends. Sometimes it'll be in the desert where they're marched into oblivion in the desert. Other times, taken the valleys and massacred along the way. Just depends on which army you're talking about and so forth. If you guys are curious about this topic, there's all kinds of important books you guys can read. Source on the Syrian, Armenian, Greek genocide. That book on the left is the history of the Armenian genocide. Would be a good choice. 30-year genocide. That goes farther back. That talks about some of the earlier massacres against our Armenian community. The U.S. ambassador, who we just saw him here a minute ago, his account of that. And then Talat Pasha, a biography of the Turk most singularly responsible for the genocide. Of course, it's not just him, but he's the most important architect of it. Operation Nemesis is an assassination plot to kill those who are most responsible for their Armenian genocide. The Black Dog of Fate and the Burning Tigris, also both of them by Peter Bilkin, are both also important works describing what America was doing this time period. Again, we were not involved in it, but America watching this, being horrified by this. Is there anything the U.S. can do? And the Armenian community in the United States also seeing this and wondering, is there something more we could do as they watch their people be exterminated across the ocean? There's been some movies that come out recently, relatively recently. The Promise, which came out in 2017, and The Autumn Lieutenant. Both those have quite different takes, but I'd recommend either one of those to you to give you guys a little bit of a sense of this terrible event. Again, these events tend to be not so well known, but both these movies, I'd probably recommend The Promise over The Autumn Lieutenant. But the Promise probably have some better sense. But Autumn Lieutenant, either one of those, recommend to you guys for extra credit to give you a bit of a sense of what we're talking about. Now, I've talked almost entirely about the Armenian genocide, but the Syrian community is similar. Now, if you're a Syrian, you think, what is this? This is people who claim ancestry all the way back to the ancient Assyrians, but in the New Testament time period, early Christianity, they converted to Christianity. So, in the context we're talking about, again, they're a religious minority within the Ottoman Empire. They'd be primarily today what we would probably think of northern Iraq. But northern Iraq is controlled by Ottoman Turks during this era. They also are viewed with suspicion, and they also, during the larger context of Armenian genocide, are also going to be targeted. Again, we don't know the numbers nearly as well. Not enough scholarship has gone into this topic. So the numbers vary, but in general, perhaps 200,000, 300,000 Assyrian Christians are killed during the larger Armenian genocide, and for similar reasons. Again, you on that, there'll also be but take me northern Iraq and into southern Turkey, a little bit into Syria as well too. As you guys know, we have a large Assyrian community locally. I happen to live in the Turlock area, in the metropolis of Denair. And as you guys know, there's a large Assyrian community locally, and they are well aware of these events. And again, if you're not in the Assyrian community, you might not be aware of these terrible massacres, but there's a strong awareness, obviously, in the Syrian community of what has taken place to the community and what they've suffered during World War I. And since then, too, because it's not been easy since then either as well. Some of you perhaps have Assyrian friends and family. It's not been easy. There's been a lot of things, but certainly the Ottoman Turks' attempt to exterminate the Assyrian minority is one of the great challenges they dealt with in the 20th century. The Greeks also. Now, this is a little bit, again, a bit similar, but a little bit different context. The Greeks also are a Christian minority within the Ottoman Empire, and this is a history that goes way, way back, because as you guys are probably aware, the ancient Greek world included what today would be the west coast of Turkey. Ancient Troy, western Turkey. You had many important Greek city-states along the coast of what today would be western Turkey. That's part of the Greek world. So there have been a long, very strong Greek connection to the geography of Anatolia or Turkey, and that's going to complicate things even further, and I'll try to give you guys a short version of this as I'm watching the time go by. But the Greeks, as you guys know, as a nation, have been under the Ottoman Empire and had already fought a war for independence. But the Greek community in what today is Turkey had not gotten independence yet, whereas the Greek mainland across the Aegean Sea has, by this time period, become independent. That's part of the upsurge in nationalism, which you talked about in our earlier lecture. So the Greeks had won their independence, but there's many Greek minorities in today the west coast of Turkey, these classical cities that go back to earliest recorded history, and they would like to be part of the new independent Greek state. So at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire is shattered and perhaps almost ceasing to exist, there's a lot of excitement among the Greek minority along the west coast that they would be Turkey, that perhaps the Greek army can arrive there on the coast and liberate them, and they can carve out, again, a larger Greek nation that includes historic Greek settlements that have lined the west coast of today we call Turkey, or they used to call ancient world Anatolia. And that does happen to some extent. And again, this is a longer story. I'm trying to give you a short version of this. So the Greek army does invade. You see the 1919-1922 Greco-Turkish War. So the Greeks are trying to reclaim actually large portions of what today would be Turkey. And you see this map there on the right. You see all the area you guys see there in a yellow has a significant Greek minority. And so with the teetering, greatly weakened and defeated Turkey or Ottoman Turkish Empire at the end of World War I, they're almost like on a heartbeat of maintaining their status as a nation state. Their empire is entirely gone. But the question is, can the Ottoman Turks even hold on to what today is Turkey? And the Greek armies they cross the Aegean and they push into the western portion of Turkey, and in the eyes of the Greek minority, liberate them from Turkish control. But long story short, though, the Turkish army is going to recover under Kemal Atatürk, and they're going to eventually expel all the Greek armies who had pushed into western Turkey here and actually kick them to the sea. Why does it matter? Of course, because obviously the local Greek populations who had welcomed them, participated in them, even been involved in some violent reprisals against the larger Ottoman Turkish majority around them once the Greek armies arrived. And there had been some Greek violence against the Turkish population, not surprisingly. There's been some bad blood there. So when the Greek armies were here in western Turkey and they were appearing to be victorious, you did have some violence from the Greek population against the Turkish majority population around them. But of course, the tide shifts, and the Turkish armies are able to push the Greek armies entirely out of what today is western Turkey, and they're having to flee by sea. And so the Greek minority populations who briefly saw, as they perceived it, liberation, now come under the control of a very angry, profoundly suspicious Turkish occupation force, and that leads to large-scale reprisals and violence against the Greek minority population. The most famous of this by far would be the city of Smyrna. Today it's called Izmir. And again, we don't have time to get into the details there, but if you're curious about that, I'd recommend The Great Fire by Louis Erlich, When Are Americans' Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide, and the one there on the right as well, too. Now, importantly, how the Turks view these events. To this day, you guys are probably aware of this, Turkey denies categorically that there was any planned genocide against the Armenians, the Assyrians, or the Greeks. Now, they will say in the terrible fighting in the war that yes, a significant number of Armenians and Assyrians and Greeks were killed, but there was no intentional extermination campaign. That yes, maybe some individual army commanders did intentionally kill very large numbers, these Christian minority or nationalist minority groups, but there was not a system-wide government-employed campaign to eliminate any of these three groups. They very strongly deny that and reject that interpretation, say, yes, of course many died. And they'd agree that many died, thousands of thousands. Probably even they would go into tens of thousands, maybe into hundreds of thousands, but that was just the chaos of war. There was no systematic Holocaust-like campaign against these religious ethnic minorities. Now, Turkey is largely alone in that interpretation. You're not going to get many credible historians who agree with that. I think Turkey remains in denial. Now, the way Turkey gets away with this is it's true. On the one hand, again, some Turkish communities and even Turkish minor leaders did not actively participate in this. And Turkey was chaotic enough, in a sense, in the war years that it's true some isolated Armenian communities or Greek or Syrian are left alone, where that would not be the case typically in the Holocaust, as you guys know. But that being the case, that's probably a case of the Ottoman Empire struggling with centralization and authority from the top to impose its policies. So the intent, I think, is unquestionably there to exterminate the Armenians. Now, did some local Turkish leaders resist this and not participate? Yeah, that's true. But I think unquestionably the intent was there overall for genocide. Yeah. Now, the Turks will also point out that they suffered terrible losses during the War of Civilians, and that's true. They're not making that. You see, estimates are the total number of Turkish deaths around 2.5 million. And that's civilians. So the Ottoman Turkish population in general suffered mightily in this war, whether it's from the fighting itself or disease or the chaos of the war. So Turkey's not wrong in that Turkey itself, besides losing the empire, also saw a lot of death internally in the fighting. That's true. So no one's denying that the Turks did not suffer a great deal in this chaos and the sadness and tragedy of World War I. I think that's all true. And then obviously part of those numbers would be in the Turkish Greco-Turkish War of 1922. Terrible human rights abuses on all sides, and the Turks sometimes are also the recipient of intentional religious or ethnic or nationalistic violence at the hands of the Greeks, and the Greeks were still in the process of expanding their control into Turkey before that Turkish armies kicked them out. And so unquestionably that Turkey saw its very survival at stake. Yeah, that's true. They did. They felt like they may not cease to exist as a nation. And they're not totally wrong about that. Turkey was teetering the point of collapse as a nation. The empire is already gone. But just today, geographically, Turkey itself was at the point of perhaps disintegrating. But they would survive. And as you guys know, they're many proud people to this day. So, to summarize all this, where all these qualifiers are true, which is not all Turks participated in the genocide. It is not as systematic as perhaps we would imagine it to be. The Turks also suffered mightily and terribly in this war, sometimes recipients themselves of intentional ethnic violence and ethnic cleansing. All true. But that still does not remove the fact that unquestionably all the scholarship points to that there's unquestionably the Armenian population was the target of a genocidal campaign by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And to some degree as well, the Syrian community, as you guys know, and the Greek community within Turkey as well. All right, let's move on to the Sykes-Picot, and this will definitely be on the exam, along with what we just talked about, of course. So we were talking about Lawrence of Arabia, and the Arabs hoped to revolt against the Ottoman Empire and have some kind of perhaps pan-Arabic state develop. Well, while those aspirations are being nurtured in the homes and tents and buildings of the Arab community in the Ottoman Empire, secretly behind the scenes, Great Britain and France have no intention of allowing that to happen. In fact, they passed what's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, in which following presumed victory on the part of Great Britain and France against the Ottoman Turkish Empire, that Great Britain and France would divide up the former Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and divide up among themselves as colonies or areas that are controlled by Great Britain and France. France would receive Lebanon, Syria, and parts of Turkey. England received Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. Let me show you a map here. So the general spheres of influence are as you see them here. So France is going to take the areas there in blue. The Italians are talking about taking the other areas there, which you guys see there in green. That didn't really happen, by the way. And the British are going to take the areas you see here, which today would be Iraq, excuse me, and a little bit into Jordan. There's another look at it too. The areas in blue are going to be direct control or at least influence, and the areas there in pink and red are going to be controlled by Great Britain. That is not, of course, what the Arabs had in mind. This is a secret pact, naturally. Now, Lawrence Arabi did find out about this and worked hard to try to thwart or stop this plan. He felt it was deceitful, which, yeah, it was. It was. There's not many in warfare. There's not many people who escape without having some perhaps complicity or duplicity on their hands, and this is certainly true of the Sykes-Picot Treaty, secretly dividing up the Middle East to be colonized in the event of victory after the war. So all this promises to the Arabs about we'll help you get independence, just join us in a guerrilla campaign against Ottoman Turks, and when we do, we'll help you set up your own independent pan-Arab nation. That is a lie. That was not their intention. But of course, that is what's going to happen. So consequences of this, not surprisingly, eventually the Arabs find out what's going on, and there's deep bitterness. Yes, not surprisingly, especially because they are colonized after this. And that's not just theoretical. Sykes-Picot was not simply a secret pact. It becomes a reality once the war is over. National boundaries are drawn up by the French and the British, and this is very important, so make sure you guys, and you're taking notes here, make sure you guys get this down. National boundaries are drawn up, but these oftentimes go through deep religious, ethnic, tribal divisions that are very complicated. So these new nations that are drawn up, for example would be like Lebanon, for example, or Syria, or Iraq. These are all new formulations geographically. And oftentimes these lines do not correspond with the reality on the ground. Now, by the way, the reality on the ground is quite complicated too. There would not have been easy ways to partition these up. So you could have had even the Arabs themselves. It would have been a tremendous struggle probably to partition these things up. You have all kinds of ethnic groups there. They're not all Arab. You have the Kurds, for example, in northern Iraq. You have many groups. Then even within the Arabs, you have differences of religion, Shia and Sunni. It can get quite complicated. But unquestionably, the Europeans are carving these out. Is going to make artificial boundaries, which are very hard to make a reality. Sorry, a little break. My car insurance was calling. So, okay, so let's keep going here. I think we'll fast forward that. Now, this is also very important too, and this is Balfour Declaration. And I'm going to make this short because I don't want to get too deep into Middle Eastern history since it's a European history class. But again, it's going to be very important, the larger context. Of course, Europe is never detached from the larger world around it. And that is secretly in 1917, Great Britain, again, hoping to win the war, is another kind of measure to have to do this. Great Britain promises to support a Jewish homeland in Palestine in 1917. There's quite a few, they want Jewish supporters, both financially in England and other places to support the war effort, plus any Jews who already were living in Palestine to be supportive of the British campaign to defeat the Ottoman Turks, who still control Palestine at this point in the war. So hedging their bets, you see Great Britain both talking to the Arabs, well, not just Great Britain and France, talking to the Arabs saying, revolt, and we'll assist you in that revolt, and that'll help you carve out an independent Arab nation once the war is over. Simultaneously double dealing Great Britain on its own talks to the Jewish community, which is a minority, said, if you support us in the war effort actively, once the war is won, you'll support the formation of a Jewish nation in Palestine. Now, as you guys are aware from Theodore Herzl and others, there had already been a strong push among some within the Jewish expatriate community around the world for a return to a Jewish homeland, especially, as you guys know, based on the ongoing pogroms, violence, exclusion, even in Western Europe, of the Jewish community. We're not even into the Holocaust yet. We're talking about the lead up into World War I, but there's still anti-Semitism was alive and well, tragically, and so the Jewish community is looking for a safe haven. Now, at the time, the Jewish community made about 11% of the area of Palestine, which today would be Israel. So they're there, but they're a small minority of a much larger Palestinian and Turkish population. I think for time, we're going to fast forward past this. But this is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey. And I can more fast forward this, but he is going to emerge out of the ashes of World War I as the most important nationalistic leader, helps Turkey survive the loss of its empire, but still maintain the traditional homeland, which today is geographically, you now know as Turkey. But I think for time, we're going to fast forward past that. Let's briefly mention Zionism. Zionism, as you guys know, is a desired homeland for the Jews, and the desire to make that happen. But of course, it is very complex. There's many different visions of this, of what this would look like. Not to mention, as you guys know, the Jews are 11% of the population at that time because of the terrible wars that go back to the ancient world, the Roman world, where Jews had been historically excluded, exiled, forced out of their, or massacred, forced out of their community. But the Jewish desire among some to return is going to get new life with the Balfour Declaration. Of course, it's very complicated because the local Palestinians or Arabs already are living there. That certainly is not their dream. There's going to be a Jewish state suddenly imposed upon them. So both the Jews historically have a good claim to this territory. Some of the contemporary debates of this, I think, both from some Palestinian activists and some Jewish activists, they intentionally ignore legitimate claims of the other side. As a historian, both sides, both the Jews and the Palestinians, both have very long, we're talking hundreds, sometimes thousands of years claims to this land. The problem is they're both claiming the exact same land. It's holy to both the Christian community, obviously the Jewish community, and the Islamic community, making it more complicated because Jerusalem is there. And there's a lot to this topic. I just want to introduce it briefly in the context of what's going to happen later on with Europe as well, too. Significant Jewish immigration takes place during this era. Again, the Balfour Declaration, given that at least the vision that Great Britain will support this. Now it's more complicated because later British governments backed off from the Balfour Declaration, so it's not so simple that Great Britain said, we're going to help you do it. In reality, the next government backed off from this, but still that initial excitement that this will be sponsored by Great Britain led to a surge of immigration. The local Palestinian community is deeply fearful of this. The Ottoman Turks are now gone. And so now you have this growing Jewish presence with the still majority, what you would say Palestinian presence. That leads to escalating conflict and violence on both sides. And that's just the whole topic itself. So we're gonna leave that. I just mentioned a couple of very good books on this. Jerusalem 1913, which I have right in front of me. There we go. I highly recommend it to you. It's actually a fairly quick read, but I could give you guys a real good sense of how Jerusalem looked like just prior to World War I. The Turks, of course, are still there. They're still part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire at that time period. So you have the Turks as the imperial overlords. And then beneath them, you have the majority Palestinian community or Arab community. Then you also have a minority Jewish community. But already there's concern by both the Jews and the Arabs or Palestinians of what's going to come next. And the author, Amy Marcus, is arguing that sadly 1913 is a great dividing line between potentially a future that could have embraced both Palestinian and Jewish designs on independence from the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and perhaps they could have found a way to live peacefully together in the same land, which, boy, wouldn't that be wonderful? But then that began to break down because you have the individual Palestinians and Jewish leaders who are maximalist. They want the whole land to themselves. They're not interested in some kind of pluralistic, open, tolerant society that allows both communities to live there peacefully. You have individuals from both sides who want the other excluded, and they want this land entirely to themselves. You do have some moderates in the middle, but sadly the moderates in the middle are not going to win this argument. Other good books there too, but we better move on. Other things too, Beirut, Jerusalem by Thomas Friedman is outstanding, and some other good books there too. But and I think we're going to get close to wrapping it up. A terrible pandemic takes place, which is very resonant in our time period right now. As you guys know, there's a last terrible pandemic to sweep the world, the Spanish flu, although we don't use that term so much anymore. We refer to it as the 1918-1919 flu because we don't know its origin. And its origin remains to this day contested. Various theories. But if you're familiar with the coronavirus, and tragically many of us are, as you know, the Spanish flu or the 1918-1919 flu, perhaps a better term for today, is the world's last terrible pandemic that swept through the world. John Barry's Great Influenza, The Pale Rider, The Pandemic, in his books would be really good introductions to this very important topic and a sadly timely topic, as you and I know. Finally, I want to get to the end and wrap this up. The peace settlement at Versailles, and you guys probably are generally familiar with this. I just want you all to make it quite short and simple because this lecture is already 50-some minutes. So we get to the end here. At the end of World War I, it's hard for you and I to underestimate the trauma and the loss and the anger and the bitterness, especially on the part of victorious nations. France and England are deeply angry. Hundreds of thousands of young men will never come home. They'll never be at that dinner table again. Lives destroyed, their economies devastated, their cultural losses, the potential of all these lives lived that now abruptly came to an end, families shattered, population shattered. There's tremendous anger toward Germany. So Versailles Treaty, perhaps famously, as you guys know, is a very harsh treaty on Germany. Revenge is not too strong a word for what it was. Tremendous anger. So the peace treaty both humiliates Germany and places tremendous financial strain on Germany. Germany has to pay for the entire war. When I say the entire war, I mean the cost of war. And then additionally, for each British, Italian, etc., French soldier, Belgian soldier killed in the war, etc., Germany is expected to pay their entire lifetime income that individual would have made if they would have survived. So you don't simply pay for reconstruction and the immediate bill of the war, which Germany's going to have to, but you also have to pay for all those lives cut short and all the income of all those individuals by the millions of money they would have made over their lifetime that, of course, evaporates in the terrible trenches and the acrid smoke of gunpowder in the trenches of Western Europe or wherever that may be. Germany cannot begin to pay for this. They're humiliated by this. There's a wonderful cartoon. Clemenceau is shown right here, the French premier right here, inviting the Germans to a dinner discussion of the Versailles Treaty. You can see the food and the chairs. Obviously, this is no dinner. This is a revenge ceremony. Woodrow Wilson had a much more lenient plan, but most of it is rejected, as you guys know, by the victorious Allies. Some of the 14 points will be accepted, but that has more implications beyond Europe, although some within Europe too. Certainly in reformulating Eastern Europe, some of Wilson's 14 points will play a very important role in that. But the larger vision of Wilson's 14 points is not going to be enacted because France and Britain, the two great drivers of the Versailles Treaty, are not willing to countenance any kind of soft or gentler approach to defeated and hated Kaiser's Germany. The League of Nations is put together. That is one of the things they did like for Wilson's 14 points. The League of Nations, as you guys probably aware, is a fairly weak version of today's UN. I'm not saying it didn't do some good work, but it's a fairly weakened version of today's UN, was formed out of the ashes of the Versailles Treaty. But of course, it remains to see the power of the League of Nations, and as we all know, it's going to be largely an inability to have much effect on the larger world when the world comes to blows in the context of World War II. And we better stop right there. That's enough for this lecture. So that's a lot to digest right there. But these are all important topics framing the world you and I live in. Hope you guys are good. And that's the end of this lecture. So we'll see you with the next one. Take care, everybody.